If power had a sound, Reinhard Heydrich's would not be a shout, nor a fiery speech. It would be a low, constant, almost imperceptible noise, like that of a machine working behind a closed wall. He didn't need to be seen for his presence to be felt. And perhaps that is precisely what makes his trajectory so unsettling. Heydrich did not impose himself through the theatricality of evil, but through the silent efficiency with which he transformed ideas into procedures, orders into systems, and violence into administrative routine. The question that arises from the beginning is not how he became feared, but at what point terror ceased to seem like an exception and became just another function of the state. His entry into the Nazi world wasn't driven by explicit ideological vocation or political protagonism. The path was simpler, almost bureaucratic. In 1931, Heydrich was introduced to the SS in a context of open opportunities for those who knew how to organize, structure, and obey. There wasn't yet a fully formed empire of repression. What existed was an expanding movement, lacking internal control, surveillance, and information. It was in this functional space that he fit. His first major mission didn't involve weapons or courts, but archives, reports, data cross-referencing, and threat identification. Creating an internal intelligence service seemed at first glance a technical task, but there lay the embryo of something much bigger. The service that Heydrich helped structure, later known as SD, was not limited to observing declared enemies. It produced suspects. It cataloged behaviors. It established patterns of deviance. Gradually, the definition of threat ceased to be objective and became elastic. What had begun as political surveillance became an instrument of social control. Those who observed did not need to morally justify their actions, only to comply with protocols. This was one of the first gears of the system that Heydrich would help consolidate: the replacement of individual responsibility with the logic of function. His rise was rapid because it was functional. Heydrich didn't compete for space with speeches or public ambitions. He delivered results. Each well-structured report, each expanded network of informants, each successful operation reinforced the idea that the regime needed this type of operator. Obedience wasn't blind, it was technical. And this raised an uncomfortable question. To what extent can efficiency become morally neutral when the system that uses it is destructive? As Nazi power consolidated, the SD's scope of action expanded. Initially focused on political opponents, it began targeting unions, intellectuals, religious groups, and ethnic and social minorities. There was no single decree that transformed this process into mass persecution. What occurred was an accumulation of administrative decisions, each justified by security, stability, or order. Terror did not arrive all at once. It was gradually normalized. This normalization is perhaps one of the most disturbing aspects of Heydrich's trajectory. Nothing seemed extraordinary within the internal logic of the system. In 1933, with the restructuring of the police forces, Heydrich began to operate in an even broader sphere. The distinction between political police, intelligence, and repression began to disappear. The state began to monitor itself and its citizens in an integrated way. In this context, information ceased to be merely knowledge and became an instrument of punishment. Evidence could be fabricated, accusations could be shaped, and legality adapted to the needs of the regime. The question that emerges is uncomfortable, but inevitable. When the legal system bows to ideology, who defines the boundary between law and abuse? The consolidation of this model reached a decisive point in 1934. The elimination of the SA leadership was not merely an episode of internal violence, but a clear sign that the regime had chosen absolute discipline over any parallel autonomy. Heydrich played a central role in this process, not as a visible executor, but as the organizer of the information that would justify the action. Dossiers, reports, and accusations constructed the narrative necessary to legitimize the purge. It was not a moment of improvisation, but of calculation. The machine showed that it knew how to eliminate its own parts when it deemed it necessary. From that point on, the path seemed clear. Each new function assigned to Heydrich further integrated him into the core of power. He not only carried out orders, he helped shape the means by which those orders would be fulfilled. Repression ceased to be episodic and became structural. Fear began to be managed as public policy. Yet, Heydrich rarely appeared as a central public figure. His strength lay precisely in his operational invisibility. This development raises one last question for this stage of history. At what point does an individual cease to be merely a part of a system and become one with it? Heydrich did not create Nazism, but he helped make it functional in its most brutal aspect. His rise was not marked by fiery speeches, but by technical decisions that, combined, built one of the most efficient repressive structures of the 20th century. And what was yet to come would show that this efficiency would have consequences far beyond internal control. The next step would not only be to monitor and punish, but to organize destruction on an unprecedented scale. If this story caused you discomfort, curiosity, or even reflective silence, then it served its purpose. What you just heard is not the end. It's merely the tip of the iceberg of a system that will reveal just how far obedience can go when power is no longer questioned. In the next part, you will understand how seemingly technical decisions transformed into mechanisms of destruction on a historical scale. If this content makes you think, like the video, follow the channel and leave your comment. Your participation keeps this type of analysis alive and ensures that the continuation reaches you. What transforms a system into something truly dangerous is not only the violence it produces, but the way that violence comes to seem normal to those who execute it. In the second phase of Heydrich's trajectory, this normalization becomes evident. What was once selective surveillance and repression begins to function as a continuous mechanism integrated into the daily life of the state. For those within the structure, the work did not seem exceptional. There were schedules, orders, reports, goals. As in any large modern organization, each sector fulfilled its function without necessarily seeing the final result. This logic is uncomfortably close to the common world. People who perform tasks, follow procedures, and believe they are not responsible for the whole. As the regime progressed, Heydrich's influence expanded almost automatically. He didn't need to demand power. The system pushed him into increasingly central positions. The political police, intelligence services, and administrative bodies began to operate in a coordinated manner. Information gathered in one sector fed into decisions in another. An anonymous denunciation could lead to imprisonment. A malicious report could mean disappearance. To those observing from the outside, it seemed like terror. To those operating from within, it was routine. This disconnect between action and consequence is a key point. Think of someone who works with numbers, spreadsheets, or processes without directly seeing who will be affected. The human impact becomes diluted. That's exactly what happened on a state scale. Heydrich helped create a model where repression didn't depend on explicit hatred in daily life, but on efficiency. Evil didn't need to shout, it just needed to function. With the start of the war, this logic expanded beyond German borders. The occupation of territories brought new administrative challenges. How to control entire populations, how to neutralize potential resistance before it even arose. The answer was the creation of mobile units tasked with security. The name was bureaucratic, almost harmless. In practice, these units followed the army's advance and carried out orders of systematic elimination. Initially, the targets were local leaders, intellectuals, people considered influential. The idea was simple: to break the backbone of the occupied society. But the process didn't stop there. The categories of enemies expanded. Entire communities came to be seen as a potential threat. What began as targeted repression evolved into something much larger. And here emerges an element that connects this story to everyday life: gradual adaptation. Nothing changes overnight. Each step seems small compared to the previous one. This is how moral boundaries are crossed without many realizing the exact moment of rupture. Accounts from the time show that even the perpetrators began to show signs of psychological burnout. Not because they questioned the system, but because the repetition of the violence took a human toll. This detail is important. The problem, in the eyes of the leadership, was not what was being done, but how it affected the efficiency of the men involved. The solution found was not to stop the actions, but to make them more functional. Methods were altered to reduce direct contact between perpetrator and victim. Administrative logic prevailed again. Meanwhile, in offices far removed from the executions, Heydrich and other leaders transformed violence into planning. Meetings, memos, formal authorizations. The language was technical, devoid of emotion. People became numbers, flows, statistics. It is here that the historical suspense intensifies because the system begins to reveal its ultimate goal, even if not openly declared to the public. Everything indicated that what was underway was neither temporary nor improvised. For the average citizen under the regime, the feeling was one of powerlessness. Small daily choices took on disproportionate weight. A poorly chosen word, a comment overheard by the wrong person, a resentful neighbor. Fear seeped into daily life, shaping behavior. And this is perhaps one of the most disturbing aspects of this phase. The terror depended not only on the police or the army, but on widespread distrust. The system worked because people adapted to it in order to survive. At this point, Heydrich was no longer merely an executor of orders. He had become a central organizer of large-scale repressive policies. His role was to ensure that everything functioned smoothly, without improvisation, without failure. Efficiency was seen as the ultimate virtue, and the more efficient the system became, the harder it was to imagine an alternative. The point of no return was approaching. There's a quiet moment in this story where the question shifts from "how far will this go?" to "how could this have happened?" The answer isn't in a single shocking event, but in the sum of seemingly rational decisions. That's what makes this phase so unsettling. There isn't a movie villain in every scene, but a set of administrative choices that together build a machine of destruction. When this machine finally turns to a broader and more definitive plan, the world is already at war, borders closed, and options drastically reduced. What will follow will not only be repression or control, but an attempt to organize elimination on a continental scale. And at that moment, Heydrich's role will cease to be merely that of an efficient manager and become that of one of the main architects of an unprecedented project. The next part will show how this administrative logic reached its peak, and how the system itself, by becoming absolute, began to generate the conditions for its reaction and downfall. There comes a point when any structure based solely on control begins to reveal its cracks. In Heydrich's case, this moment didn't arise from personal regret or an internal change, but as an inevitable consequence of a system that had become too large, too rigid, and too violent to remain invisible. When he assumed direct command of Bohemia and Moravia, the method was already fully formed. There was no longer any need to experiment, adjust, or test limits. Everything already worked. And precisely for that reason, everything began to be exposed. The occupation of Prague demonstrated how administrative terror, when applied without filters, leaves deep scars not only on the direct victims, but on the whole of society. The fear wasn't just in the public executions or arbitrary arrests. It was in the silence of the streets, the cautious conversations, the constant feeling of being watched. For many, life continued in an apparently normal way. Work, family, small routines. But behind this normality lay the perception that any stability was fragile. This coexistence of routine and threat is something that transcends time and connects with the present. Whenever systems demand absolute obedience in exchange for security, the price is usually invisible at first. The assassination attempt that wounded Heydrich was not merely an act of armed resistance. It symbolized the rupture of an idea that seemed unquestionable, that the system was invulnerable. For the first time, the machine encountered direct resistance. The reaction was immediate and brutal, as expected. Entire villages were destroyed, families torn apart, lives extinguished as a message. But, paradoxically, this extreme violence produced the opposite effect to that desired. Instead of consolidating fear, it revealed to the world the true face of the regime. The system, in defending itself, exposed its own moral bankruptcy. Heydrich's death did not end the functioning of the machine he helped build. It continued operating for several more years under different names and with different faces. But something had changed. The illusion of perfect efficiency began to crumble. The system that depended on total obedience began to generate internal collapses, disputes, excesses, and errors. At the end of the war, what remained was the need for accountability. Documents, orders, and records made it clear that nothing had been improvised. Everything had been planned, organized, and executed within formal structures. Heydrich's legacy lies not in personal achievements, but in the model he helped consolidate. That of a power that hides behind processes, positions, and functions. And that's where history ceases to be merely the past and becomes a practical warning. Systems don't become oppressive overnight. They advance when efficiency becomes more valuable than conscience, when obedience replaces questioning, and when people convince themselves that they are not responsible for the whole, only for their part. The practical application of this reflection begins with something simple yet essential: observing the systems of which we are a part, at work, in politics, in institutions, in social relationships. Honestly asking ourselves what the real impact is of decisions that seem small. Questioning procedures that cause harm, even when presented as normal. Developing the ability to say no, to ask for explanations, to not accept ready-made answers when they conceal injustice. History shows that great tragedies are built upon small concessions repeated over time. Another concrete step is cultivating active empathy. This doesn't just mean feeling, but acting based on an understanding of the other. In modern contexts, this can mean not reproducing dehumanizing discourses, not treating groups as numbers or stereotypes, not accepting simple solutions to complex problems involving real people. Efficiency without humanity always comes at a high price. Recognizing this is a form of silent but powerful resistance. Finally, there is the responsibility of memory. Knowing stories like this is not an exercise in morbidity, but in prevention. When we understand how authoritarian systems work, we become more attentive to the initial signs: the normalization of exclusion, the trivialization of verbal violence, the idea that certain ends justify any means. Transforming this knowledge into action means choosing daily not to be merely a passive spectator, but someone aware of their own role within the structures that shape society. If this story made you reflect, question, or see parallels with the current world, continue this conversation. Subscribe to the channel to follow the next chapters, like the video so that this content reaches more people, and leave your comment. If you prefer, share your experience or question anonymously. Your participation is essential to keeping alive a reflection that should never be forgotten.